Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the 9th in a series of programs I'm doing on morality and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. In my last program in this series, I zeroed in on the possibility of using a moral principle as a guide to morality. For example, hurt no one, rather help all as much as you can. Again, hurt no one, rather help all as much as you can. Hurt no one. Who could disagree with that? The fact is, people have often disagreed over whether people were getting hurt by certain behaviors, by engaging in certain behaviors. Historically, the outstanding example would be slavery. I've mentioned that slavery existed in virtually every area of the world at one time or another, and that Christian nations, both Protestant and Catholic, eagerly participated in the slave trade, which proved to be a very profitable business. I've mentioned that the Catholic Church did not condemn slavery, did not declare slavery to be evil until the late 19th century. I also pointed out that as late as the late 1700s, Catholic popes had Muslim galley slaves. And also, I've mentioned that most of the slave owners in the southern part of the United States prior to the Civil War were Protestants. And that it was a rare Protestant minister who publicly declared slavery to be evil. In my last program, I focused on Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, a very famous U.S. senator who in the years prior to the Civil War was regarded as the spokesman of the South. He himself was a slave owner, and in 1837, in a speech before the United States Senate, Calhoun declared slavery to be a positive good. Those are his words. Slavery is a positive good. Calhoun was no ordinary senator. Besides, again, being the spokesman of the South, the political spokesman of the South for many years, he was also elected to the vice presidency of the United States. His own words now. Slavery, again, his own words, slavery, quote, is instead of an evil, a good, a positive good, end of quote. He declared it to be the best possible relation between white people and black people. So, if Calhoun and other slave owners in the South were to be guided by the moral principle, hurt no one, rather help all as much as you can, they would have declared slavery, and indeed did declare slavery to be moral, because they claimed it was good for both white and black people. Indeed, Calhoun compared slave labor to free labor in many other countries, and said this, and again I'm quoting John C. Calhoun, "In few countries is so much left to the share of the laborer, and so little exacted from him, nor is more kind attention paid to him in sickness or infirmities of age." This might seem incredible to many contemporaries in the sense that, again, Calhoun is saying he believed that the slaves had it better than many free workers in the world, and especially in Europe, but even in the United States. Of course, Calhoun neglected some very important facts. Slavery, besides obviously violating some very important human rights, also violated what we would call today family values. How so? Well, slave marriages had no legal recognition. Slaves could not legally marry. Why so? Well, we know that slavery was a business, and it was not unusual for husbands and wives to be split apart by the sale of one or the other. Not to mention, it was not unusual that slave children would be sold to an owner other than their parents. So the idea was, had the South legalized slave marriages, it might have made it more difficult to split up families. Also, I think Calhoun would be loath to point out that slave children were denied an education. A good slave, according to people like Calhoun, was an illiterate slave. The idea was if you educated slaves, the slaves would be more difficult to control. Calhoun apparently believed that harsh punishment was also part of, or a necessary part of what he called a positive good. Again, you recall he referred to slavery as a positive good. In 1831, one of Calhoun's house servants, house slaves, ran away. He was eventually found by a local jailer and placed in jail. And Calhoun sent these instructions to the jailer, and I'm quoting Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. I wish you would have him lodged in jail for 1 week, to be fed on bread and water, and to employ someone for me, to give him 30 lashes well laid on at the end of the time. Again, 30 lashes well laid on. I also wonder if Calhoun believed that the vulnerability of slaves to sexual abuse was a positive good. It doesn't take much imagination to understand that the potential for sexually abusing people in a system of slavery was pretty great. That such a man, Calhoun, was elected to the vice presidency of the United States, I think speaks volumes about the mindset of many of the American people prior to the Civil War. The German philosopher Nietzsche said this: insanity in individuals is rare, but in groups and nations it is the rule. I wonder if our Civil War, the United States Civil War of the 19th century, might be an example of what Nietzsche was talking about. Indeed, Nietzsche said this, the words I just quoted, after the Civil War. Again, he was a German, and he uttered those words in the late 19th century. Why might the American Civil War be an example of a nation gone crazy, or at least part of a nation gone crazy? Well, essentially because one side, the South, insisted that people be allowed to own slaves. It is true that historians say the Civil War had several causes, but I think it's fair to say there is a consensus among historians that there would have been no Civil War if the South did not perceive that President Lincoln was a threat to slavery. You might recall when Lincoln was running for the presidency in 1860, he said that he didn't want slavery to expand any further in the United States. He did not say he was going to abolish it, but he was pretty clear on the idea that he did not want to see it expand. Also, Lincoln, prior to the Civil War, had declared slavery to be immoral, to be evil. So that When it was announced that Lincoln had won the election of 1860, several southern states took immediate action. As you probably recall, shortly after the announcement of Lincoln's election, 7 southern states seceded. In other words, they declared they were not part of the United States anymore and were forming their own country called the Confederate States of America. And later, other southern states joined it. So again, I'm suggesting to you that essentially the Civil War was fought because one side insisted that people be allowed to own slaves. Imagine young Christian soldiers in the South dying so that slavery could continue to exist. It is estimated that at least 500,000 Southern boys and men were either killed or wounded in the Civil War. Would it be an exaggeration? Would it be an exaggeration to say the South's motto could easily have been, "Give me black slavery or give me death"? What do you think? Remember Nietzsche, the German philosopher's comment that insanity in individuals is rare, but in groups and nations it is the rule. Perhaps another outstanding example would be Nazi Germany. We know that in Nazi Germany, Jewish people experienced the insanity of 6 million of them being killed for no other reason than that they were Jewish. And this would include the murdering of Jewish infants and toddlers. In fact, we have eyewitness accounts of Nazi soldiers bayoneting Jewish infants and toddlers. Shakespeare said, "What fools these mortals be." Many thinkers have claimed if one wishes to live a moral life, one must distance oneself from the majority of people in any society. The idea is, according to many famous thinkers, that the majority of people in any society operate at a rather low level of morality. Among these thinkers was psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, one of the most famous 20th century psychiatrists. Frankl was a Jew and a Holocaust survivor. His wife and several other members of his family were killed in the Holocaust. Following his release from a concentration camp, Frankl resumed his practice of psychiatry and wrote many books and again went on to become famous. He commented on this idea that only a minority of people are very moral. Allow me to give you psychiatrist Viktor Frankl's own words. "It is true that decent people form a minority. What's more, they always will form and remain a minority. And yet I see therein the challenge for us to join the minority." He went on to say, "Since Auschwitz, we know what human beings are capable of." I mentioned that Franklin was a thinker in a long line of thinkers who did not regard the majority of people in the world as being very moral. Another example would be the American writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. He talked about the disgraceful deference to the majority and also said this, and I'm quoting Emerson, "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." And Henry David Thoreau, Emerson's best friend as far as we know, Thoreau said this, and I'm quoting him, "There is but little virtue in the actions of the masses of men. There is but little virtue in the action of the masses of men." You recall, at the top of this program, I suggested a moral principle that might serve as our guide, or your guide, or some people's guide to morality. Again, hurt no one, rather help all as much as you can. And I've indicated it sounds good. This principle sounds good, and I think it is often helpful. But I mentioned that unfortunately there is often disagreement over whether someone is hurting someone else. And again, Calhoun being a good example of this, referring to slavery as not an evil, but rather a positive good. Another outstanding example, I think, of where human beings have disagreed about whether somebody was being hurt was imperialism. The act of one country taking over another country. We know that so many of the so-called great countries in the world have at one time or another engaged in imperialism, engaged in the conquest of another country. Among former imperialist countries are the following. Spain, at one time probably the greatest imperialist power in the world. England, at another time probably the greatest imperialist power in the world. The United States, yes, the United States engaged in taking over other countries without their permission. And Japan. Japan took over several countries in the Far East, including Korea and a huge chunk of China. And of course, the old Soviet Union. The old Soviet Union took over almost all of what is now considered to be Eastern Europe. One of the reasons often given by the conquering nation was that it wanted to uplift and modernize the country it was taking over. Let's examine Spain's imperialism. I mentioned before, Spain at one time was not only the greatest imperialist power in the world, but Spain back in the 16th century was regarded as the most powerful country in the world. Well, we know that beginning with Columbus in 1492, the Spanish took over much of Latin America. Following Columbus came what are usually referred to as the conquistadors. These were Spanish mariners, admirals, who led the way in taking over various parts of, again, what is now Latin America. And what reason did Spain give for taking over what is now Mexico and Guatemala, Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, etc.? What reason did the Spanish give? Well, they said they wanted to Christianize the Indians, and also they wanted gold. They tended to emphasize, by the way, Christianizing the Indians more than they emphasized getting gold. And what's the historian's verdict on Spain's behavior in Latin America? Well, we know that the Spanish enslaved Indians, brutalized Indians, murdered Indians. Indeed, in 1514, again, in the year 1514, the Spanish forced the conversion of Indians to Christianity under the threat of death. Interesting way to get people to become Christians. Either you become Christians or we will kill you. Perhaps the most illuminating report and record of Spain's brutality towards the Indians comes from one of the few heroes in this situation, a priest, a Roman Catholic priest who was truly upset by the way, in fact, that's an understatement to say he was upset by the way his Spanish colleagues were treating the Indians. His name was Bartolomé de las Casas. Again, Father Bartolomé de las Casas. Again, he kept a record of Spanish brutalities and eventually wrote a book about it. Writer Kenneth Davis, in commenting on the Spanish genocide committed against the Indians in the Americas, said this. And by the way, in this passage, he also refers to what Americans did to Indians in what is now the United States. Again, writer Kenneth Davis's words on the genocide committed against the Indians. In the 400 years between Columbus's arrival and the massacre of Indians at Wounded Knee in the United States in 1890, upward of 90% of an estimated 40 to 100 million Indians were wiped out. Again, upward of 90% of an estimated 40 to 100 million Indians were wiped out in one of the largest ethnic cleansings the world had ever witnessed. All in the name of progress, civilization, and the God of Christianity. Again, the Spanish claiming to do good, claiming imperialism would be good for the Indians. Another example of imperialism and a so-called intention of doing good was the imperialism of the old Soviet Union. I mentioned before, the Soviet Union took over much of Eastern Europe. And what was the reason they gave? Well, they wanted to introduce communism, which they claimed would end economic exploitation. Again, communism would be a kind of panacea. It would solve the problem of some people exploiting the labor of other people. It would solve the problem of some people being very rich and other people being very poor. Well, what was the result? What was the result of the communists taking over countries like Romania, Albania, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, etc.? Well, historians tell us it was a disaster. There was a denial of human rights on a grand scale, secret police, censorship of the media, the Berlin Wall, actually building a wall down the middle of the city of Berlin, separating the communist sector from the non-communist sector. Why the need for a wall? Why the need for a wall with an electrified fence on top? Well, because many people were attempting to escape from communist Berlin to democratic Berlin. And we also know the communist promise of a better economic life for the people of Eastern Europe did not materialize. Instead, there was economic stagnation. I remember my trips through Eastern Europe shortly before the communists lost their power, and then again shortly after they lost power. And it was obvious to me in countries I visited, such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia, that communist rule had proved to be an economic disaster. And it was also interesting to visit West Berlin in Germany and East Berlin in Germany, and to see how modern and prosperous democratic West Berlin was in contrast to communist East Berlin. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the United States also engaged in imperialism. An outstanding example would be the year 1898. In 1898, the United States beat Spain in a war, the famous Spanish-American War. It was at this time that Spain was losing power. And we demanded in the peace treaty that Spain turn over to us some of the areas she was ruling, namely Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So again, in this treaty signed in 1898, Spain turned over to the United States Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. We also gave Spain $20 million for these properties. Well, there was disagreement in the United States whether we should take over these areas, whether it was proper for the U.S. to take over these areas, since these areas had not consented to be ruled by the United States. There was an especially big argument in our Congress and elsewhere in America concerning whether we should take over the Philippines, a series of islands in the Pacific. President McKinley was the president at the time. He argued that we should take over the Philippines. And the arguments he gave were these. He said if we took over the Philippines, we could educate the people, uplift the people, and Christianize the people. Yes, he said that. We could Christianize the people. Well, the Filipinos rebelled. The Filipinos rebelled. They did not want to be ruled by us. The United States sent 70,000 troops, 70,000 troops to suppress the rebellion. It took 3 years. There were many casualties. Did we do the right thing? Did we do the right thing in taking over the Philippines? President McKinley and many other people in the United States said, yes, we did. But there were more than a few other people, prominent people, who said, no, we did not. Indeed, in the United States, an organization was formed called the Anti-Imperialist League. An organization was formed called the Anti-Imperialist League. In this organization were such prominent people as Andrew Carnegie, perhaps the richest man in America, who was against imperialism, and also the Harvard professor William James. They both claimed that our taking over the Philippines was an evil deed, a very vile deed. That was their word, vile deed. I'll have much more to say about this next week, but I see I'm running short on time. As is my custom, I want to close with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. In Walden, his masterpiece, Thoreau said that we are all artists. He penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.